flight that should have been routine carried within it the spark of something unforgettable, a chain of events no one on board could have predicted. What began as a quiet dispute over a single seat unraveled into a story that exposed hidden truths, tested authority, and revealed a twist so powerful it would ripple far beyond the cabin walls. The incident seemed small at first, almost ordinary, but what it became forced the world to watch and to question what dignity and justice really mean. Before the full story unfolds, make sure you like this video to help it reach others. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think might be waiting in this journey. Marcus Johnson was no stranger to the heavy weight of being judged the moment he walked into a room. As a tall black man with dark brown skin, he knew before he even opened his mouth, people often decided who he was, what he could afford, and where he belonged. That judgment followed him through childhood, through Harvard classrooms, through boardrooms filled with white executives, and even now as he boarded Atlantic Skyways Flight 2289 from New York to Los Angeles after 3 grueling days of meetings. Marcus had built his company from the ground up, pushed through every insult, every doubt, and every dismissal that came with being a black man in an industry where most doors opened only for white faces. He wanted nothing more than to sink into a seat, close his eyes, and let the silence of the cabin wash away the exhaustion. But when he reached row 2, all of that hope was shattered. Catherine Whitmore, a blonde woman in her late 40s with diamonds on her fingers and entitlement in her posture, sat in 2A, his seat, as if she owned not only that cushion of leather, but the entire cabin. Her cream sweater, designer handbag, and casually arrogant demeanor screamed wealth and privilege. She scrolled on her phone, ignoring him entirely, her manicured nails tapping against the glass as if the world existed only for her comfort. Marcus stopped in the aisle, gripping his boarding pass tightly. He cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me, I believe there's been a mistake," he said, voice steady though he felt the eyes of nearby passengers already lingering. Catherine barely looked up. Her eyes flicked over him, his hoodie, his dark jeans, his sneakers that cost more than most rent checks, but would never be recognized as luxury by people like her. And she smirked as if the very idea that he had a claim to the seat was amusing. "I'm sure we can work something out," she said smoothly. "Why don't you find another seat? I've already made myself comfortable here." Marcus tightened his jaw. He had lived his life in spaces where he was constantly told he did not belong. The honors program in high school, the Ivy League halls of Harvard, the venture capital meetings where older white men looked at him like a charity case. Now, in the narrow aisle of first class, he was being told yet again that his rightful place was conditional. "Ma'am," he said calmly, holding out his boarding pass, "this is C2A, my assigned seat." Catherine finally deigned to glance at the slip of paper, her lips curling into a patronizing smile. "Yes, I can see that, but surely you understand mistakes happen. I'm a platinum member. I specifically requested this seat. The attendants can find you something more appropriate." Appropriate. Marcus had heard that word in so many contexts. It always meant the same thing, that his presence was inappropriate, his skin inappropriate, his existence in spaces of wealth and power inappropriate. He took a deep breath, aware of the stares burning into him from other passengers. A man in a suit leaned forward to watch. A woman whispered into her husband's ear. Others buried their faces in magazines, pretending not to see, the universal sign of people unwilling to confront injustice. Marcus stayed still, refusing to yield. "With respect," he said, "this is my seat." Catherine laughed, sharp and dismissive, a laugh meant to humiliate. "Sweetheart," she said, drawing out the word with deliberate disrespect, "I think you're confused about how things work here. This is first class. People here don't usually dress the way you're dressed." Her eyes slid over his hoodie again, and the message was clear. She was not objecting to his clothes. She was objecting to his skin, to the fact that a black man dared to sit where she believed only people like her belonged. Marcus had endured bullying his entire life because of his black skin. In school, kids had called him names, and teachers had assumed he was a troublemaker. In college, professors had doubted his abilities until he outperformed his peers. In business, potential investors had questioned his credentials twice as hard as they questioned his white counterparts. And now, here, Catherine Whitmore was replaying the same old script, trying to push him out of a seat he had every right to occupy simply because he was black. He inhaled slowly, reminding himself of the watch on his wrist, a gift he had bought himself after his company went public. Reminding himself of the laptop in his bag that contained contracts worth millions. Reminding himself that he was not just another passenger. He was a leader, a survivor, a black man who had fought tooth and nail to sit in every space people said he could not. He looked Catherine in the eye and said quietly, "This is my seat, and I intend to sit in it." Catherine's smile hardened, her entitlement flashing sharper. She leaned back, lifting her chin. "Well, I've been flying Atlantic for over 15 years. I'm a platinum member, and I know how these things work. They'll find you another seat. They always do." Her words carried the arrogance of someone who had always been protected by the system. Around them, the cabin was silent, passengers watching like spectators at a theater. Marcus felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the anger of being bullied for the color of his skin. He could move to avoid conflict, as he had done countless times before, but something inside him refused. Not today. He had spent his life giving way to keep peace in a world that never protected his peace in return. He would not give up his seat. He would not bow to her prejudice. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Catherine shifted her bag slightly, her posture one of possession, as if daring him to push her further. Marcus remained calm, his deep voice carrying the weight of centuries of injustice when he repeated, "This is my seat." The word cut Marcus deeper than if she had shouted an insult, because he knew exactly what it meant. Appropriate had been thrown at him since childhood, a word that wrapped racism in politeness, a word that told him he was out of place without saying the quiet part out loud. In 5th grade, a teacher had told him his haircut wasn't appropriate for a school assembly. In high school, the principal had told him his speech about inequality wasn't appropriate for graduation. At Harvard, a professor had told him his attire wasn't appropriate for networking events, even when his white classmates showed up in the same casual clothes. And in every boardroom where he was the only black man at the table, investors and executives had implied that his very presence was somehow inappropriate. Now Catherine was using the same poison, dressing it up as logic, and the cabin silently absorbed her words. Marcus's hand clenched around the boarding pass as he felt the anger rise, not just at her, but at the history behind her tone. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice enough to be calm, but loud enough that the watching passengers could hear. "Appropriate," he repeated, letting the syllables hang in the air. "This is my assigned seat. The only thing inappropriate here is someone refusing to move when they know they're in the wrong seat." Catherine tilted her head back, feigning shock at his defiance. "Sir, please," she said, her lips curling in a smirk. "There's no need to get defensive. I'm trying to resolve this quietly, but you're making it uncomfortable for everyone." Marcus stared at her, stunned by the audacity, though he had seen it 1,000 times before. She was flipping the script, painting herself as the calm problem solver and him as the aggressor, the unreasonable one, the angry black man disrupting the peace. That was how it always went. Black men who stood their ground were called threatening. White women who occupied their space were called dignified. He saw the shift in the eyes of some passengers, the discomfort of people who would rather he just gave up the seat and spared them the tension. His voice stayed calm but firm. "I'm not making anyone uncomfortable. I'm simply asking you to respect my boarding pass." Catherine let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as though amused by a stubborn child. "You don't understand how these things work. Platinum status carries weight. The attendants know that. They'll take care of you, don't worry." Marcus recognized the patronizing tone, the subtle bullying of someone cloaking racism behind airline policies. He knew she didn't care about platinum status because she had no boarding pass for 2A. What she cared about was maintaining dominance, asserting that she had more right to the seat than the black man who had legitimately booked it. He could feel the simmering tension in the air as more passengers leaned in to watch, some whispering, others shifting uncomfortably in their wide leather chairs. He thought of all the times he had let things go, swallowed the insult, walked away to avoid escalation. But not today. I understand exactly how these things work, Marcus said, straightening his shoulders, his tall frame imposing in the aisle. I booked this seat, I paid for this seat, and this seat belongs to me. Platinum status doesn't change that. Catherine's expression flickered, a hint of irritation breaking through her practiced arrogance. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into a condescending whisper that still carried through the quiet cabin. You should be grateful they even let you in here dressed like that. Don't push your luck. The words hit Marcus like a slap, his skin the unspoken target of her sneer. He felt the familiar sting of being bullied for existing while black. She wasn't just questioning his clothes. She was questioning his place in first class, his right to sit among the privileged, his worth measured only by the color of his skin. The hum of the plane's ventilation seemed louder, the silence around them tighter, as if the entire cabin waited to see whether he would back down. He didn't move. He didn't blink. Gratitude doesn't buy my ticket, Marcus replied evenly. Money does. And mine paid for this seat. A man in the row behind them cleared his throat nervously, and a woman across the aisle looked away quickly as though embarrassed by the confrontation. But Marcus caught the eye of an older black couple in row 4. The man gave him the smallest nod, a gesture of solidarity born from decades of knowing exactly what it meant to be treated as if you didn't belong. Catherine huffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice louder now so the entire cabin could hear. We all know how these things usually work. People with loyalty status get priority. You don't seriously think they'll move me for you, do you? Her confidence was dripping, her voice almost daring him to admit defeat. Marcus felt the heat in his chest, the pulse of humiliation fighting with determination. Every instinct told him to stand his ground, not for the seat alone, but for every moment of casual racism he had endured, every time he had been told to step aside, every instance where silence had been demanded of him so that others could stay comfortable. He thought of the boy he had been, bullied in school hallways for being black, told by teachers to calm down, when all he did was defend himself, warned that his future would vanish if he ever appeared too defiant. Marcus stood his ground in the narrow aisle, the boarding pass still in his hand, the murmurs of first-class passengers flowing around him like a current. Catherine Whitmore sat back in seat 2A with a smug certainty of someone who had never been told no, her diamond earrings catching the overhead light as if they too were a declaration of superiority. She looked at him as though the conversation was already over, as though she had won simply by sitting still, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Beneath his calm exterior, beneath the hoodie and jeans that Catherine mocked in her mind, beneath the patience worn into his bones by years of being told to be flexible, to swallow insults, to make himself smaller so that others could feel comfortable, lay a truth none of them knew. Marcus Johnson was not just a paying passenger in seat 2A. Marcus Johnson was the majority owner of Atlantic Skyways. 3 years earlier, when his tech company had skyrocketed after its IPO, he had orchestrated a complex series of acquisitions, buying controlling interest in the very airline that Catherine now claimed as her loyal domain. 62% of Atlantic Skyways belonged to him, from the wings of the aircraft parked at gates around the world to the reservation systems that processed platinum memberships, like Catherine's. Yet no one here had any idea. To them, he was just another black man trying to sit in a seat that someone else decided was not his. Marcus could have ended it in an instant. He could have pulled out his phone, called his assistant, or tapped a few commands into the executive app that lived on his device and summoned the weight of corporate authority to crush Catherine's arrogance. But he didn't, because he had learned long ago that power revealed too early was often dismissed as arrogance. People would call him combative, say he threw his weight around, accuse him of intimidation. It was better, far better, to let the truth unfold slowly, to let people show who they really were when they believed there would be no consequences. Catherine was showing it now, and so were others. The woman across the aisle kept sneaking glances at Marcus as though waiting for him to erupt, her lips pressed thin in judgment. The man behind Catherine sighed loudly, muttering under his breath about delays, though his irritation seemed aimed more at Marcus's refusal to yield than at Catherine's refusal to move. The flight attendants whispered near the galley, already forming opinions about who was difficult and who was reasonable. Marcus felt the weight of it all pressing on him, the familiar theater of bias playing out in real time, and he stayed perfectly still, letting the moment build. Catherine crossed her legs, her pointed heel tapping impatiently on the floor, and said in a tone that dripped with entitlement, "I really don't see why you're making such a fuss. This is first class. There are other seats. Why don't you just take one and stop holding everyone up?" Marcus turned his gaze to her, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Because it's not your seat. It's mine. And I'm not moving." The firmness in his tone startled her, though she quickly masked it with a scoff. She leaned back, folding her arms, certain the system would back her, certain that the flight attendants would take one look at his skin and his clothes and decide she was the one who belonged. Marcus could almost read her thoughts because he had seen them reflected in countless faces over the years. It wasn't about a seat. It was about hierarchy, about who society deemed worthy and who it didn't, about who could claim space and who had to surrender it. And Catherine had lived her whole life assuming she sat at the top of that hierarchy. What she didn't know, what the entire cabin didn't know, was that the man standing quietly before her was the one person in the world who had more authority on this airplane than anyone else, including the captain. Marcus felt the buzz of his phone in his pocket. His assistant Kai no doubt sending updates from Los Angeles about the board meeting that had been moved, about the investors waiting for his arrival, about the contracts that would shape the future of his company. But none of it mattered more than this moment. Because this moment was not just about Marcus Johnson, the CEO. This was about Marcus Johnson, the black man, the one who had been bullied in school for his skin, the one who had been asked to show ID twice at the bank when his white colleagues walked through without a question, the one who had been told over and over that his rightful place was always negotiable. Catherine shifted again, sensing perhaps that he wasn't the type to back down, and her tone hardened. "Look, I've flown with this airline for 12 years. I know the staff. I know the rules. I know how this works. You don't." Marcus almost smiled, the irony so sharp it was bitter. She believed loyalty miles gave her authority, while he literally owned the airline. She thought knowing the crew gave her power, while every decision they made ultimately reported to him. She thought her years of privilege could trump his boarding pass, while his signature could ground every plane in the fleet. He could have said it then, could have dropped the truth like a hammer and ended the entire farce, but he didn't. Not yet. Because moments like this mattered. Because the way Catherine acted when she thought he was powerless was more revealing than anything she might say if she knew who he was. He studied her face, memorizing the sneer, the way her lips tightened in disdain, the way her voice curved around phrases like appropriate and fuss, as though his insistence on fairness was an inconvenience to her comfort. And he let her continue, because each word she spoke was another layer of the truth being peeled back. The passengers watched with the tense curiosity of an audience waiting for a play to reach its climax, and Marcus stood center stage, refusing to step aside. His silence was not weakness. It was strategy, because he knew something Catherine did not. That power held quietly is often the most dangerous kind of all. The hum of the engines and the quiet shuffle of boarding passengers in the rear of the plane could not mask the growing tension in first class as Marcus Johnson remained standing in the aisle, refusing to yield his seat to Catherine Whitmore, who sat in 2A with the smug poise of someone who believed she was untouchable. Catherine tapped the armrest with her manicured nails, her expression shifting between irritation and satisfaction, as if the very delay she was causing would ultimately serve as proof of her superiority. Marcus stood calm, though his heart pounded with the weight of every set of eyes now locked on him. Passengers silently judging, some hoping he would back down, others watching with curiosity, and a few, especially the older black couple in row 4, silently rooting for him not to bend. The tension finally drew the attention of a flight attendant. Emily Brooks, her navy blue uniform crisp, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, approached with a trained smile of someone used to diffusing passenger disputes. Her eyes flicked first to Catherine, then to Marcus, and Marcus recognized the shift immediately. The subtle tilt of her chin, the warmth in her greeting reserved for Catherine, the cautious reserve when her gaze fell on him. "Good afternoon," Emily said in a pleasant voice. "I understand there's a seating issue here. Can I see your boarding passes, please?" Marcus handed his over without hesitation, his hand steady, his face neutral. Emily glanced at it quickly, then up at the seat number above Catherine's head, and her smile faltered for just a moment. She knew immediately that Marcus was in the right, that 2A was his. Catherine, however, jumped in before Emily could speak. "Thank goodness you're here," Catherine said in a tone dripping with relief. "I booked the seat, as I always do. I'm a Platinum member, as you can see on my profile. This gentleman insists it's his, but I think there's been some sort of mistake." Catherine gestured toward Marcus, as though presenting a problem to be solved, not a man with a valid claim. Emily nodded politely, but her voice took on a careful edge when she turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, I see that your boarding pass does say 2A, she said, her smile tightening. "However, Mrs. Whitmore is already settled here, and she's one of our most valued customers. To avoid further conflict, perhaps we can find you another excellent seat in first class. Row 3 has an aisle seat with extra legroom. I'd be happy to provide complimentary drinks and priority service for the inconvenience." The words landed heavy in Marcus's chest. He had heard variations of this proposal his entire life. Be flexible, step aside, keep the peace, don't make trouble. It was always him, the black man, who had to bend so others could stay comfortable. He looked into Emily's eyes, reading not malice, but something just as damaging, assumption. She assumed Catherine was more valuable, more deserving, that Marcus could and should compromise. Catherine's lips curled into a satisfied smile as she placed her handbag more firmly on the seat beside her, marking her territory. Marcus inhaled deeply, steadying himself against the sharp sting of humiliation. He spoke calmly, his voice even but resonant enough to carry through the hushed cabin. "You're suggesting that I give up my confirmed reservation so someone else can remain in a seat they didn't book?" Emily's cheeks flushed faintly, but her training held, and she kept her smile in place. "I'm suggesting a solution that minimizes disruption for everyone," she said, her voice rehearsed. Marcus shook his head slowly, his boarding pass still in his hand like evidence in a trial. "Minimizes disruption for whom?" he asked. Emily faltered, her lips parting as though searching for a reply, but Catherine jumped in, eager to take the lifeline. "Oh, I think it's perfectly reasonable," Catherine said quickly. "I'm already here, and he can move a row back. Everyone wins." She smiled as if she had solved the puzzle, her condescension sharp enough to cut glass. The cabin was silent, every passenger listening. Marcus could feel their stares like heat against his skin, some sympathetic, others impatient, and some filled with a subtle expectation that he should simply accept the compromise. He thought again of all the times he had been asked to compromise. The time in college when a professor told him not to overreact, when a classmate mocked his skin. The time in his career when an investor asked him to bring on a white co-founder because it would make people more comfortable. The time at a restaurant when a hostess seated him at the back while giving prime tables to white customers who walked in behind him. Compromise had always meant surrender. And now Emily, standing in her polished shoes and professional smile, was asking him once again to surrender his rightful place because the woman who had taken it was white and wealthy. Marcus straightened, his voice low but clear. "No," he said, "this isn't about disruption. This is about fairness. I paid for this seat, I checked in for this seat, and I will sit in this seat. Platinum status doesn't override a confirmed boarding pass." Emily's smile cracked slightly, the tension in her shoulders betraying her unease. She glanced around the cabin, aware of the watching eyes, aware that whatever happened next was being judged silently by dozens of passengers. Catherine huffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "You see," she said to Emily, "this is exactly what I was talking about. He's being difficult for no reason. I've been a loyal customer for years, and now he's trying to cause a scene." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity, but instead he kept his tone steady. The only scene here is a woman refusing to move from a seat she didn't book and a flight attendant suggesting the black passenger should be the one to compromise. A ripple of discomfort passed through the cabin, and even Emily looked startled at his bluntness. But Marcus didn't care. He was tired of swallowing the truth. He was tired of compromise. He was tired of being bullied into silence. Emily shifted her weight, her smile faltering now, her voice less confident. "Mr. Johnson, please, let's not escalate this. I'm sure we can work something out." Marcus met her eyes, his own gaze unwavering. "The only thing to work out is for Mrs. Whitmore to move to the seat she actually booked. That's the only solution that respects both the rules and my dignity." Catherine scoffed loudly, muttering something about entitlement, but Marcus stayed focused on Emily, watching as she hesitated, caught between protocol and prejudice, between fairness and the easy way out. Around them the silence grew heavier, the watching passengers sensing that this was no longer a simple seating dispute, but a moment that revealed something deeper, something raw about race, privilege, and who was always expected to yield. And Marcus, standing tall in the aisle, knew he would not yield. Not this time. The cabin air was thick with silence after Marcus's refusal to yield, his voice cutting through Emily Brooks's polite but biased attempt to push him aside. Catherine Whitmore sat with her arms folded tightly, her lips pursed into a smirk that was meant to convey victory, but Marcus could see the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth, a hint of frustration that her entitlement had not yet crushed him into submission. Emily shifted uneasily, torn between enforcing fairness and protecting the platinum customer who had grown used to winning. The other passengers remained silent, their gazes fixed, but their mouths closed. As though speaking up might draw them into a controversy, they preferred to watch rather than confront. Then, from a third row, a voice broke the silence, clear and steady, carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "Excuse me," said Isabel Ramirez, a Latina woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked black hair and a reporter's instinct for tension. She held up a press badge clipped to her blazer pocket, the emblem of the New York Times gleaming faintly under the cabin lights. "I've been watching this entire exchange, and I want to be perfectly clear. This is not a seating dispute anymore. This is discrimination." Her words sliced through the air like a blade, and several passengers gasped softly, as though the word itself carried too much weight to be spoken aloud in such a setting. Catherine's head whipped around, her eyes narrowing at Isabel with indignation. "Excuse me? This is none of your business," she snapped, her voice sharp with anger. But Isabel only smiled, not kindly, but with the confidence of someone who had documented stories like this before. When a black man with a confirmed boarding pass is told to give up his seat to accommodate a white woman who refuses to move, it becomes everyone's business, Isabel said firmly. "I've covered too many cases where prejudice was brushed aside as a misunderstanding. That's not what's happening here. This is blatant." Emily stammered, trying to reassert control. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but we can handle this internally." "No," Isabel interrupted, her tone final. "What I see is a man being asked to compromise his dignity to avoid inconvenience for a woman who believes her platinum status outweighs fairness. That is not customer service. That is systemic bias." Marcus felt a jolt of gratitude wash through him, though he kept his expression composed. For once, someone else was naming the truth aloud instead of leaving him to shoulder it alone. Catherine's face flushed red, her lips trembling with fury. "This is outrageous. You don't know me. You don't know what you're talking about. I've been flying Atlantic Skyways for 12 years. I am one of their best customers. He's just trying to make a scene." "A scene?" Isabel shot back. He showed his boarding pass. "You're the one in the wrong seat. The only scene here is your refusal to acknowledge reality because you can't stand the idea of being corrected by a black man." The cabin erupted into murmurs, some passengers nodding subtly, others looking away even more uncomfortably. Emily raised her hands in a placating gesture. "Please, everyone, let's keep our voices down." But the moment had already grown beyond her control. From the fifth row, Naomi Lee, a Korean-American college student wearing headphones around her neck and a university sweatshirt, lifted her phone higher. She had been recording quietly for several minutes, but now she spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "I'm live streaming this to my followers," Naomi announced. "There are about 2,000 people watching right now, and they're all saying the same thing, that this looks like racial discrimination." The words struck the cabin like a thunderclap. Catherine's head snapped toward Naomi, her eyes wide with outrage. "You're filming me? You can't do that. I don't consent to being recorded." Naomi shrugged, her face calm, but her voice steady. "This is a public incident on a commercial flight. And what I'm seeing, and what thousands are seeing, is a black man being bullied out of his seat. People need to know this still happens in 2025. Catherine sputtered, her words tripping over themselves. "You people are unbelievable." The phrase hung in the air like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the cabin, several passengers turning sharply to glare at Catherine. Marcus felt a chill roll through him, not because the words surprised him. He had heard them too many times before, but because of the raw, unguarded prejudice they revealed. Isabel's pen flew across her notepad, capturing every detail. She looked up sharply. "Did you just say you people in reference to everyone pointing out your behavior? Because if so, I want to make sure I quote you accurately." Catherine's face drained of color as she realized what she had said, but she recovered with a defiant tilt of her chin. "That's not what I meant. I meant journalists and social media people. I didn't mean," Isabel cut her off. "It doesn't matter what you think you meant. What matters is what you said and the context in which you said it." Naomi's livestream counter ticked upward, her phone screen glowing with comments scrolling too fast to read in full. "We're at 5,000 viewers now," Naomi said calmly, though her voice carried a note of triumph. "And let me tell you, they're not siding with you." Catherine looked around the cabin, realizing with growing horror that the tide had shifted. Where before she had enjoyed silent complicity, now she saw disapproval, shock, even disgust. The older black couple in row for exchanged knowing glances, the woman whispering something to her husband that Marcus couldn't hear, but could feel in the solidarity of their gaze. Marcus remained silent through it all, his decision not to reveal his true power sharpening into something deliberate. He wanted Catherine to show every ugly corner of her prejudice. He wanted the flight attendants and passengers to reveal their biases under the weight of the moment. He wanted the truth to stand naked before the world, because he knew that when the time came to reveal who he was, there would be no denying what had transpired here. Emily, visibly shaken, tried again to soothe the situation. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Whitmore, please, let's find a resolution before this escalates further." But Naomi's voice cut across hers. "Too late. It's already escalated. It's on the internet now, and the internet doesn't forget." Marcus's eyes lingered on Naomi for a moment, silently thanking her courage. He knew young people like her were often the first to document, to shine light where institutions preferred shadows. He turned back to Catherine, his voice low, but carrying enough force to reach the far corners of the cabin. "You said you people. You accused me of making a scene. You told me to be grateful I was even allowed in first class. And now the world is watching." Catherine's face burned crimson, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her handbag. She looked less like the untouchable platinum member and more like a cornered figure caught in the spotlight of truth. Isabel closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "I'll be writing about this," she said flatly. "And I'll make sure the headline captures exactly what happened. A black man with a valid boarding pass being told to move because a wealthy white woman refused to give up a seat she never booked. That's not a misunderstanding. That's systemic racism." The murmurs in the cabin swelled, and Marcus felt the moment crystallize around him. For the first time since the confrontation began, he felt the tide of power begin to shift, not because of his hidden authority, but because witnesses were refusing to look away, refusing to remain silent, refusing to let the story be rewritten as his fault. He breathed deeply, his eyes never leaving Catherine's, and he knew the truth was no longer confined to the walls of the plane. It was out in the world, and it could not be silenced. The cabin felt electric after Isabel Ramirez declared Catherine's behavior discriminatory, and Naomi Lee's livestream grew to thousands of viewers, their comments flooding the screen with outrage, disbelief, and solidarity. Catherine Whitmore sat rigid in seat 2A, her face pale, but her eyes still blazing with entitlement, clutching her designer handbag like it was a shield against accountability. Marcus Johnson stood tall in the aisle, his boarding pass visible in his hand, his calm composure cutting sharply against Catherine's frantic defensiveness. Flight attendant Emily Brooks hovered between them, her practiced smile collapsing under the weight of the confrontation, her authority crumbling as she realized the moment had spiraled far beyond her control. Then the cabin door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Thomas Reynolds stepped into the aisle, a tall man in his early 50s with a weathered face and gray at his temples. Reynolds carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. His uniform was immaculate, his voice steady as he addressed the cabin. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I understand we have a seating issue here." His eyes swept quickly from Marcus to Catherine to Emily, and Marcus saw the subtle way his gaze lingered on Catherine just a beat longer, as though instinctively drawn toward the comfort of siding with the familiar. Catherine immediately leaned forward, her tone shifting into the polished graciousness of someone confident authority was finally here to protect her. "Captain Reynolds, thank goodness," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp. "I'm Catherine Whitmore, a Platinum member. I specifically requested this seat, but this gentleman insists it's his. I've been flying this airline for over a decade, and I know how these things usually work." Marcus held out his boarding pass without a word, his jaw tight, his body still and composed. Captain Reynolds took the slip, glanced at it, then looked up at the number above Catherine's head. His face gave away the truth immediately. He knew Marcus was right. Seat 2A belonged to Marcus Johnson. But instead of handing the boarding pass back and resolving the matter with simple fairness, the captain cleared his throat, shifting his weight slightly, his voice calm but diplomatic. "Mr. Johnson, I see that this seat is assigned to you," he began. "However, Mrs. Whitmore is already settled here, and she is one of our valued longtime customers. Sometimes, to keep things smooth for everyone, we ask passengers to be flexible. There are other excellent seats available in first class. Perhaps we can move you to one of those." Marcus felt the words slam into him like a familiar weight, the sting of injustice disguised as reasonableness, the centuries-old script replayed in real time. Be reasonable. Be flexible. Step aside so others can remain comfortable. He stared at Captain Reynolds, the man who held ultimate authority in the cabin, and felt the fury rising. He kept his voice steady, but there was steel in it now. "So let me be clear, Captain. You're suggesting that I give up the seat I paid for, the seat printed clearly on my boarding pass, so that Mrs. Whitmore can sit wherever she chooses because she claims to be important?" Reynolds hesitated, his authority suddenly less absolute under Marcus's piercing gaze and the phones recording every word. Naomi's live stream ticked upward again. 10,000 viewers now, comments racing so fast they blurred. Isabel Ramirez's pen scratched furiously across her notebook, her eyes locked on the captain, as though daring him to step fully into the trap of his own bias. Catherine leaned back with a triumphant smile, certain Marcus's words only painted him as difficult, certain the captain would side with her as authority figures always had. But Marcus was not backing down. He straightened, his tall frame casting a shadow across Catherine's smug posture, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Captain, what you're doing right now is exactly the problem. You're asking the black passenger to compromise, to yield his rights, to surrender his dignity, so that the white passenger can remain comfortable. And you call that being reasonable." The words landed heavy in the cabin, the truth too raw to ignore. Several passengers shifted in their seats, their discomfort clear, their complicity suddenly exposed by Marcus's bluntness. Reynolds' mouth tightened, his jaw flexing as though he wanted to assert his authority. But the weight of being recorded, of being witnessed, of being judged by thousands watching in real time forced him to choose his words more carefully. "Mr. Johnson, I'm simply trying to prevent escalation," Reynolds said evenly, but his voice had lost some of its confident timbre. "We can resolve this quickly if you would just consider another seat." Marcus's laugh was quiet, without humor, the sound of someone who had endured this charade far too many times. "Prevent escalation?" he asked, his voice low but clear. "There is no escalation, Captain. There is only injustice. Mrs. Whitmore is in my seat. She refuses to move. And instead of asking her to respect the rules, you're asking me to step aside. Tell me, at what point does this stop being customer service and start being discrimination?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Reynolds blinked, his composure faltering. Catherine shifted uncomfortably for the first time, her victory grin trembling as Marcus's words turned the spotlight on her entitlement. Emily's eyes darted nervously between them, her hands twisting in front of her. Isabel Ramirez raised her voice just enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Captain Reynolds, with all due respect, what Mr. Johnson just said is correct. If you're suggesting he should give up his rightful seat simply because Mrs. Whitmore has higher status, then you are endorsing discrimination, and I will report that." Naomi held up her phone so the screen was visible, the numbers climbing rapidly. "We're at 15,000 viewers now," she said. "And the comments are unanimous. They see this for what it is." The captain's face reddened as the realization hit him. This was no longer a private decision he could make quietly. Whatever he said now would live on recordings, in news reports, on social media feeds exploding with outrage. He cleared his throat again, his eyes flicking between Marcus's steady gaze, Catherine's indignant posture, and the watching passengers whose stares carried the silent demand for justice. Marcus stepped forward slightly, not menacing but immovable, his voice dropping into the quiet calm of a man who had spent his entire life navigating prejudice and refusing to bow to it anymore. "I'm not moving, Captain. Not today. Not again. Not ever. If this flight is delayed, if your departure schedule is disrupted, it will be because you allowed prejudice to outweigh fairness. But I will not yield what is mine simply because you find it easier to side with privilege." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came. Catherine shifted in her seat, her confidence cracking. Emily looked pale, her training useless in the face of truth laid bare. And Marcus stood tall, the embodiment of quiet defiance, his presence alone exposing the ugly truth that those in power always tried to hide. The silence after Marcus's refusal to yield stretched into something almost unbearable, the kind of silence that pressed against the chest and made every breath feel heavy. Captain Reynolds stood frozen, his hand still clutching Marcus's boarding pass, his authority cracking under the weight of Marcus's words and the dozens of witnesses staring at him like jurors in a courtroom. Catherine Whitmore fidgeted in seat 2A, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and rage, her confidence wobbling now that her assumptions of automatic support had not materialized as smoothly as she expected. Emily Brooks lingered just behind the captain, her smile long gone, her hands twisting together as though she could somehow knit the moment back into something manageable. Isabel Ramirez's pen moved rapidly across her notepad, capturing every hesitation, every evasion, every ounce of bias exposed under pressure, while Naomi Lee's phone showed a live stream that had already ballooned beyond 20,000 viewers. Every person on that plane knew something bigger than a seating dispute was happening, and Marcus Johnson knew it was time to change the script. He had stood silently, let Catherine expose her entitlement, let Emily reveal her prejudice, let Reynolds stumble in his authority, and now, with the world watching, the time for quiet patience was over. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out his phone. The gesture was calm, unhurried, the kind of movement that demanded attention not by force, but by certainty. Every eye in the cabin followed his hand as he unlocked the device with a quick swipe and tapped through to an app that no one but a handful of top executives in the world had ever seen. The screen lit up with the Atlantic Skyways logo, and beneath it a sleek interface of operational controls reserved for the company's majority owner. Marcus held the phone up just high enough for those nearest him to see, his voice steady, carrying through the cabin with the clarity of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Captain Reynolds," Marcus said, his tone even, "you've asked me to compromise my rights to preserve someone else's comfort. You've chosen to side with privilege rather than fairness. And since you seem unwilling to enforce what is plainly written on this boarding pass, I'll enforce it myself. His thumb hovered over a button on the screen labeled CEO Override, Ground Flight. A hush fell over the cabin, deeper than before, tinged with shock and disbelief. Catherine's scoff was immediate, brittle. "What is this supposed to be?" "Some kind of stunt," she snapped, though her voice trembled. "You think tapping a phone app is going to change anything?" Marcus's gaze never left the captain as he pressed the button. A soft chime emitted from his phone, and within seconds Captain Reynolds's radio crackled to life with an urgent voice from the tower. "Flight 2289, this is ground control. We are registering a CEO override directive for your aircraft. Confirm your status and prepare to return to the gate immediately." Reynolds blinked, his jaw slack, his hand tightening on the radio as though it might steady him. "Say again, Tower," he asked, his voice strained. The reply was immediate. "Captain, repeat. We are showing a CEO override order from Atlantic Skyways corporate headquarters initiated by Marcus Johnson. You are ordered to taxi back to the gate immediately. Do you copy?" The cabin gasped as one. Catherine's face drained of color, her mouth falling open like a door unhinged. Emily's eyes widened, disbelief spreading across her features. Naomi swung her phone toward Marcus and whispered with awe, "Holy, it's real." Isabel Ramirez sat straighter, her pen forgotten for a moment as the enormity of the revelation settled over the cabin. Captain Reynolds looked at Marcus as though seeing him for the first time, his authority crumbling in the face of a man whose power extended far beyond the aisle of an airplane. Marcus lowered his phone slightly, his voice calm, measured, impossible to dismiss. "You wanted to know who I am. You wanted me to be reasonable. Well, let me be clear. I am Marcus Johnson, the majority owner of Atlantic Skyways. I own 62% of this airline. Every plane, every route, every seat, including this one. And I will not be asked to give up what is rightfully mine." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of the engines and the hiss of circulating air. Passengers stared, some with awe, some with shame, some with a dawning realization that they had just witnessed prejudice unravel before someone with the power to expose it all. Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out in a croak. You can't be serious. You're dressed like," her words faltered, unable to conceal the prejudice at their core. Marcus's eyes locked on hers, his tone sharp but calm. "Like what? Like someone who doesn't belong in first class? Like someone who couldn't possibly afford to sit here? Like someone who should be grateful just to be allowed on board? That's what you thought. That's what you counted on. And you were wrong." Catherine recoiled under his gaze, the last remnants of her smugness collapsing into silence. Emily looked as if she might be sick, her earlier suggestion that Marcus move to avoid conflict, now exposed as an attempt to push aside the man who literally signed her paycheck. Captain Reynolds gripped the radio with trembling hands, his voice shaking as he confirmed to the tower. "This is Flight 2289. Copy directive. Returning to gate." The plane shifted slightly as the engines powered down from departure mode, the nose angling back toward the terminal. A murmur swept through the cabin, disbelief giving way to astonishment. Naomi turned her phone back toward her own face, whispering for the live stream audience, "He owns the airline. He grounded the plane. This is history happening right now." Isabel Ramirez, her pen back in motion, leaned forward and asked with the precision of a journalist chasing the story of a lifetime, "Mr. Johnson, are you saying you intentionally let this play out to reveal how people treat you when they don't know who you are?" Marcus met her eyes, his expression firm. "Yes, because what happened here today happens every day to people who look like me, except they don't have the power to ground a flight. They don't have the platform to expose it. And it's time the world sees that clearly." The aircraft rolled slowly toward the terminal, the passengers caught between awe and shame, their silence thick with the weight of revelation. Catherine sat rigid, staring at her hands, her once dominant posture shrunk into something small, something cornered. Emily avoided Marcus's gaze entirely, her face flushed, her composure shattered. Captain Reynolds remained motionless, his authority hollow, the uniform that had once commanded obedience, now a costume stripped of its power. and Marcus stood tall in the aisle, his phone in hand, his truth finally revealed. The engines whined as the aircraft taxied back toward the terminal, its scheduled departure abandoned under the weight of Marcus Johnson's command, and the first-class cabin simmered with a charged silence that was less about the movement of the plane and more about the seismic shift in power that had just taken place. Naomi Lee's live stream counter soared past 30,000 concurrent viewers, the comment feed a blur of disbelief, celebration, and fury at what had been witnessed. Isabel Ramirez, her notebook open on her lap, no longer scribbled cautiously, but instead wrote furiously, every detail feeding what would become the story of the year. Passengers held their phones at chest level or above seatbacks, recording Marcus's calm stance in the aisle, recording Catherine Whitmore's shrinking figure in 2A, recording Emily Brooks's pale and shaken face, recording Captain Reynolds gripping his radio like a man who knew his entire career now teetered on the edge of ruin. The moment Marcus had revealed his identity, his ownership, his power, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. Where once Catherine had basked in entitlement, she now shrank under the collective gaze of witnesses who saw her not as a platinum member wronged, but as the embodiment of prejudice caught in the act. Her face had lost its color, her carefully applied makeup streaking as the tears she had fought back finally spilled over. She muttered broken sentences. I didn't mean you have to understand, but none of it carried weight, not with the eyes of the world already fixed on her through Naomi's stream. Not with hashtags like #Airline racism and #Atlantic shame beginning to trend globally. Marcus ignored her pleas. He had spent his entire life listening to excuses for prejudice, people who claimed they didn't mean it that way, people who insisted their words were taken out of context, people who swore they had black friends. Excuses had never erased the sting of humiliation, and they wouldn't erase this. His attention was on the larger picture, on the truth that this incident was not about Catherine alone, but about a system that empowered her entitlement and expected his compliance. Naomi's phone buzzed audibly, her screen lighting with notification after notification. We're at 50,000 live now, she whispered, awe in her voice. It's already on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Somebody just tagged CNN, MSNBC, even the BBC. It's everywhere. Isabel looked up from her notes, her expression fierce, her voice carrying through the cabin. Mr. Johnson, the public deserves to know what you just said, that this isn't about you alone. Do you plan to address the systemic issues? Marcus met her eyes steadily. Yes, because what happened here happens to people like me every day, and most of them don't own the airline. Most of them don't have a platform to fight back. They get humiliated, told to move, told to compromise, and no one ever hears their story. But this time people will. His words reverberated through the cabin, captured by dozens of phones, transmitted to thousands, then tens of thousands, then millions. Catherine sobbed openly now. Her earlier arrogance collapsed into a broken litany of apologies that no one wanted to hear. I didn't know, she kept repeating. I didn't know who you were. Marcus turned his gaze to her, his voice calm but sharp. That's exactly the problem. You didn't know who I was, so you felt free to treat me as less than human. You thought my presence in first class was negotiable. You thought your comfort was more valuable than my dignity. And now the world is watching. The words landed harder than any shout could have, because they carried truth, and truth was inescapable when amplified by a global audience. Naomi turned her phone toward Catherine for a brief moment, capturing her tear-streaked face, then back to Marcus, whose composure only underscored the contrast. The comment stream exploded, some viewers mocking Catherine's collapse, others praising Marcus's restraint, still others sharing their own stories of bias on airplanes, in hotels, in workplaces. It was no longer just one man's stand. It had become a communal reckoning. Captain Reynolds finally lowered his radio, his face pale, his authority shredded. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of dread and shame. Mr. Johnson, he said quietly, I didn't know. Marcus's eyes held his, steady and unwavering. You didn't need to know who I was to do the right thing. All you had to know was that my boarding pass said 2A. But you chose convenience over justice, and that choice has consequences. The captain swallowed hard, unable to reply. Emily Brooks, her composure shattered, whispered, "I was just trying to avoid conflict." Marcus turned to her, his voice still calm. "No, you were trying to avoid conflict for her, not for me. You asked me to move because you assumed I would be the one to bend, the one to swallow humiliation quietly. That's not avoiding conflict. That's enforcing bias." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her training useless now that the facade of neutrality had been ripped apart. Isabel Ramirez leaned forward, her pen poised but her eyes fierce. "Mr. Johnson, this is bigger than an airline dispute. This is a civil rights story. The way you've been treated today is emblematic of systemic racism across industries. Are you prepared to take this fight beyond Atlantic skyways?" Marcus inhaled deeply, his chest rising as the hum of the engines softened in the background, the plane drawing closer to the terminal. "Yes," he said firmly, "because dignity is not negotiable, because justice cannot be optional, because what happened here today will not be buried in apologies or training sessions. It will be the beginning of real accountability." Naomi gasped softly, her eyes widening as her phone buzzed again. "We're at 100,000 live," she said, astonishment in her tone. "And hashtag Marcus Johnson is trending worldwide." Catherine covered her face with her hands, sobbing harder, the picture of a woman whose power had been stripped bare under the relentless light of truth. But Marcus barely looked at her anymore. He was focused outward, beyond the cabin, beyond the terminal, beyond the airline itself, toward the millions of people watching who had experienced their own versions of what he had endured and who were now, at last, seeing someone refuse to yield. As the aircraft slowed and the jet bridge came into view, Marcus tucked his phone back into his pocket. His power had been revealed, his authority undeniable, but his mission had only just begun. The aircraft came to a full stop at the gate, the hiss of the engines winding down into silence that seemed almost ceremonial, as if the plane itself understood that something irreversible had just taken place inside its cabin. The jet bridge locked into position with a hollow thud, and the passengers in first class sat frozen in their seats, none of them reaching for overhead bins, none of them daring to break the fragile moment. Naomi Lee's livestream feed had grown to hundreds of thousands, the comments cascading so quickly they blurred into a wall of text, people worldwide demanding justice, demanding accountability, demanding change. Isabel Ramirez's phone was pressed to her ear as she spoke in rapid Spanish to her editor at the New York Times, her notebook already thick with notes that would become tomorrow's headline. Catherine Whitmore sat slumped in 2A, her earlier arrogance dissolved into tears and muttered excuses, but no one was paying attention to her anymore. The focus, every eye, every phone, every whisper, was on Marcus Johnson, who stood in the aisle with the composure of a man who had shifted from victim to leader in the space of an hour. He adjusted his hoodie sleeve, his phone still glowing faintly in his hand, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the cabin with authority that no uniform could match. "This ends here," Marcus said firmly. "Not just this incident, not just this flight, but the pattern, the expectation that black passengers must yield, must compromise, must swallow humiliation for the comfort of others. That ends today." He turned toward Captain Reynolds and flight attendant Emily Brooks, both of whom stood rigid near the galley, their faces pale, their bodies tense with dread. "Captain Reynolds, Ms. Brooks, effective immediately. You are suspended pending investigation." Their eyes widened in unison, Reynolds' mouth opening to protest, Emily's lips trembling with shock, but Marcus raised a hand and cut them off before they could speak. "No explanations. No excuses. You both chose convenience over justice. You both sided with privilege over fairness. You will answer for that. Today." The passengers inhaled sharply, the audacity of a man suspending an entire flight crew mid-journey, sinking in like a wave of shock. But Marcus did not flinch. He pulled up another screen on his phone, tapping commands with practiced precision. "My directives are already being relayed to operations. Legal and HR will formalize your suspensions within the hour. In the meantime, you are relieved of duty." Reynolds' face reddened, his pride bruised, but he said nothing because the truth of Marcus's authority had been proven beyond question. Emily's eyes filled with tears and she whispered, "I didn't mean," but Marcus stopped her with a look, not cruel, but immovable. "Meaning doesn't erase impact," he said coldly. "Intent doesn't erase injustice." Isabel Ramirez scribbled furiously, her pen scratching against the page as though she were chiseling stone. Naomi's phone caught everything, the viewer counter spinning past 200,000, the comment feed filled with applause emojis, fire emojis, and words like justice, accountability. And finally, Marcus turned back to the cabin, his eyes sweeping across the silent passengers, his voice rising into something larger than the moment. From this day forward, Atlantic Skyways will no longer treat discrimination as a customer service inconvenience. It will be treated as the civil rights violation that it is. Every employee who touches a passenger's experience, from gate agents to flight attendants to captains, will undergo mandatory anti-bias training within the next 60 days. Every complaint of discrimination will be logged, escalated, and reviewed at the corporate level. No more burying complaints in files. No more dismissing them as misunderstandings. He tapped his phone again, opening a new interface, sleek and powerful, bearing the logo of Skynex Systems, the software backbone of a global airline industry, the empire Marcus had built from scratch. "And it won't stop with Atlantic," he continued, his eyes fierce now, his tone sharp with purpose. Skynex software powers the reservation and passenger management systems of 70% of commercial airlines in North America and nearly half worldwide. Starting immediately, every airline that uses our systems will have new anti-discrimination protocols built in. Every complaint will be time-stamped, categorized, escalated, and tracked until resolution. Patterns of bias will trigger automatic investigations. The data will be transparent, accessible, undeniable. A ripple of astonishment moved through the cabin, the passengers realizing they were witnessing not just a corporate directive, but the birth of a movement that would ripple through an entire industry. Isabel raised her head, her eyes blazing. "Mr. Johnson, are you saying you're using your company's control over the software to force industry-wide change?" Marcus's answer was immediate, his voice steady. "Yes. Because voluntary change never happens. Because apologies and training sessions don't stop discrimination. Because power only respects power. And I intend to use mine." Naomi's phone buzzed again, her eyes widening. "It's on CNN. It's on MSNBC. Even the BBC. They're all running it live. You're trending #1 worldwide. #Airline Justice is the top hashtag." Catherine finally lifted her head, her tear-streaked face pale and trembling. "Please," she whispered hoarsely. "I said I was sorry." "I didn't mean," Marcus's gaze cut to her, cold and unflinching. "This isn't about your apology," he said sharply. "This is about the system that told you it was acceptable to treat me as less than human because of my skin color. You are one person. This fight is bigger than you." Catherine's lips quivered, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Marcus turned away, uninterested in her collapse. He looked at Isabel, at Naomi, at the passengers whose silent complicity had turned into open witness. "This isn't just about one seat on one flight," Marcus said, his voice booming now, every syllable resonating like the pronouncement of a judge. "It's about the thousands of seats denied, the thousands of complaints ignored, the thousands of passengers told to be flexible when what they needed was dignity. And starting today, they will be heard." The cabin erupted, not in applause, not in cheers, but in murmurs of awe, in the quiet recognition that they had been present at the start of something monumental. Phones recorded, pens scribbled, streams rolled on, and Marcus Johnson stood tall, the architect of a movement that would outgrow even the scandal of this flight. As the jet bridge door opened and airport officials, executives, and journalists swarmed the gate, Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket. He had revealed his power. He had issued his directives. Now the world would decide how far the ripple spread. The crowd outside the gate swelled as Marcus Johnson stepped off Flight 2289, the jet bridge buzzing with controlled chaos, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, and reporters shouting questions that tumbled over one another in a chorus of urgency. He ignored the noise at first, walking steadily with Kai Williams, his young assistant, at his side, tablet in hand and phone pressed to his ear, already fielding calls from board members, journalists, and government officials. Marcus's face remained composed, his eyes steady, his posture unyielding, the image of a man who had transformed humiliation into leadership in the span of a single flight. Isabel Ramirez walked behind him, already dictating her notes into a recorder, her eyes blazing with the thrill of a journalist who knew she had just witnessed history. Naomi Lee held her phone high, her live stream now cresting 500,000 viewers, the chat filled with people praising Marcus, sharing their own stories, demanding accountability from airlines and institutions everywhere. Catherine Whitmore trailed behind under the watch of airport security, her face streaked with tears. Her once impeccable appearance crumbled into something fragile and small, the embodiment of entitlement stripped bare under the weight of consequence. She tried to speak, to defend herself, to explain, but no one cared anymore. The story was no longer hers. It belonged to Marcus and to the countless others whose experiences had been ignored for too long. As Marcus reached the gate area, he stopped and turned to face the sea of reporters, passengers, and bystanders whose phones were raised like a wall of watchful eyes. His voice carried clearly over the din, calm and deliberate, every word chosen to strike deep. What happened on that flight today was not an isolated incident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not about one woman's arrogance or one crew's failure. It was about a system that has, for decades, treated black passengers and other marginalized people as though their dignity were negotiable. That ends now. I will not allow my company or any company that relies on my technology to participate in that kind of injustice again. The room went still, the reporters leaning in, the passengers straining to hear, the live stream chat exploding with reactions. Marcus continued, his tone steady but heavy with conviction. Effective immediately, Skynex systems will implement bias detection and accountability measures across every airline we serve. No more buried complaints. No more silent humiliations. Every passenger deserves dignity, and every act of discrimination will be documented, escalated, and addressed. If airlines want to continue using our systems, they will abide by these standards. If they refuse, they can find another provider. But I promise you, the public will not forgive those who choose silence over justice. Kai looked up from his tablet, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, it's everywhere. Twitter, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, it's global now. Civil rights groups are calling this a turning point. The White House just issued a statement saying they're monitoring developments closely. Marcus nodded, unsurprised, his eyes fixed on the faces before him. Good, he said simply. Because change doesn't happen in silence. Change requires disruption. And today, that disruption began in Seat 2A. Naomi's live stream counter ticked past 1 million viewers, the comments filled with people recounting their own experiences. Black men asked to move from first class. Muslim women pulled from boarding lines for additional checks. Latino families told their documents weren't in order when they were. Asian passengers mocked for accents or questioned about their visas. The flood of stories poured across the screen, a digital chorus of injustice that had finally found its platform. Isabel Ramirez's editor called in mid-sentence, her voice sharp with urgency. Isabel, we're putting it on the front page. Lead story. This is bigger than anything we've run this year. Isabel smiled grimly, her pen scribbling one last line. From indignity to revolution, Marcus Johnson redefines the skies. Inside the terminal, Marcus's phone buzzed with another message, this time from the Department of Transportation requesting a meeting. Minutes later, another notification. Civil rights leaders organizing a press conference to support his actions. Then another. Investors praising his leadership. Skynex's stock surging while airlines scrambled to control the fallout. Kai leaned close, whispering, "You've started something you can't walk back." Marcus replied, his voice low but certain, "I don't intend to." Hours later, as Marcus sat in a quiet boardroom flanked by advisors and lawyers, the events of the day replayed across television screens mounted on the walls. Footage of Catherine refusing to move. Emily suggesting Marcus be flexible. Reynolds trying to smooth things over at Marcus's expense. And then Marcus himself, calm and resolute, pressing the override that grounded the flight. Anchors on every channel called it unprecedented. Commentators debated its implications. Civil rights leaders praised its boldness. Airline executives panicked over its consequences. And ordinary viewers, millions of them, saw in Marcus's stand something they had long craved. Proof that dignity could triumph over entitlement when power chose justice instead of silence. The following weeks became a blur of meetings, interviews, and reforms. Marcus testified before Congress. His words replayed in endless loops. When discrimination hides behind procedure, it is still discrimination. When dignity is optional, it is still injustice. And when those with power look away, they become complicit. I refuse to look away. Skynex rolled out its new anti-bias platform across airlines, the system automatically flagging discriminatory behavior, forcing reports to the highest levels of management, and publishing quarterly data for public review. Airlines initially resisted, but social media pressure and consumer outrage left them with no choice. Within months, policies shifted industry-wide. Flight attendants underwent new training. Captains were briefed on zero-tolerance directives. Passengers were reminded before boarding. Every traveler deserves respect and dignity. Discrimination will not be tolerated. 2 years later, Marcus sat again in seat 2A, not as a man forced to defend his place, but as the honored speaker for the International Civil Aviation Summit. Around him sat leaders from dozens of nations, regulators, activists, and industry titans, all gathered to discuss civil rights in global travel. He spoke with the same calm authority he had shown on that fateful flight. I never wanted to ground a plane. I never wanted to create a spectacle. I just wanted to sit in the seat I paid for. But that denial, that indignity, became the spark for something larger. And today, we stand together to ensure that no one, no matter their race, religion, gender, or appearance, will ever have to prove they belong where they rightfully are. The applause shook the room, the echo of history still alive in every clap. Naomi Lee, now a respected journalist, smiled from the press row, her live stream that day having launched her career as the voice of a generation. Isabel Ramirez, Pulitzer Prize in hand for her coverage, nodded solemnly, her pen still scribbling notes. And Marcus, older but unbowed, felt the weight of what had begun in humiliation and ended in transformation. Later, as he boarded his return flight, a young black boy approached him shyly, clutching his mother's hand. "Mr. Johnson," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with admiration. "Thank you. My mom says because of you, I don't have to be afraid to fly anymore." Marcus knelt, meeting the boy's gaze. "You never should have had to be afraid in the first place," he said softly. "But now you won't." As he settled into his seat, the hum of the engines rising again, Marcus looked out at the horizon and understood the truth. What began as one black man refusing to yield to prejudice had become a revolution that redefined the skies. It was no longer about him. It was about everyone who came after, everyone who would step onto a plane and know that their dignity was not optional, their humanity not negotiable. And as the aircraft lifted into the clouds, Marcus Johnson carried with him not just the memory of a confrontation, but the knowledge that he had turned pain into power, injustice into reform, and a single seat into a symbol of equality. The end. If this story kept you engaged, I'd like to hear from you. What do you think about Marcus's stand in seat 2A? Do you believe one person can truly turn a moment of humiliation into a movement that changes the world? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. I want to see how far this message has reached. If you believe dignity is not negotiable and justice should never be optional, then give this video a like right now. It helps this story travel further, reaching people who might need the reminder that speaking up matters. And if you want more stories that take injustice head-on and show the power of refusing to stay silent, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next one. Your voice matters, your story matters. And together we can make sure stories like Marcus's aren't forgotten, but become the foundation for change.